Hello students, I am Dr. L.K. Das, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Department of HSS IIT Roorkee. Welcome to another lecture of the NPTEL course Power and Politics in Contemporary India, a Sociological View. In this lecture, we are going to discuss a case study on Chipko movement, and through this case study, what we will do is we'll cap this entire week's discussion on different types of movements as well as how movements mobilize themselves, what is the role of leadership, what is the role of ideology, as well as what are the roles of agenda setting. So Chipko movement, the reason I have taken this topic for today's lecture is that Chipko movement is one of those movements which has not only a pan-Indian character, pan-Indian influence, but also it impacted the way we discuss and debate about our forests, rights of the local people over forests, as well as the entire globe from global north to global south. They started looking at India, they started looking at Himalayas from a very different perspective. So let us get into it. What did Chipko movement do? It started in the early 1970s in the Garhwal Himalaya, used the Gandhian tradition of Satyagraha, made a unique blend of cultural, spiritual, ecological and political elements. So in a way, what it also did was that it did not just focus on old social movements or new social movements, rather it looked at how the contexts are there in the Indian countryside and what is important for that, rather than framing it around some international as well as globalized notions of environmental debates. So what is the historical context of the Chipko movement? So did Chipko movement started in the 1970s itself, or there is some historical context that we need to understand in order to look at what led to this movement itself? So during the colonial period, the colonial state created revenues, the revenue avenues or avenues for revenues. Now what did they do? They used certain legal means in order to nationalize or privatize forest resources, water resources, land resources. In terms of forest resources, before the colonial era, the forest was owned by the community under the sovereignty of the king or the emperor. So the people had usufruct rights or use value rights over these forests, water resources or land resources. There was communal ownership of these properties. What the colonial forces did was that they nationalized these resources in order to extract them for commercial purposes. So forests were used for railways, shipbuilding as well as revenue extraction. Shipbuilding, because in the 19th century, in the 18th century, the ships were built of wood, and the kind of wood that were available in the Indian Himalayas or in the Indian forests were quite suitable for that, and there was abundance of them, so the colonial powers used and abused them the way they wanted. The same went with railway wagons as well as railway load bearing the plagues. And in terms of revenue, every aspect of forest and its resources were used for revenue, whether it is leaves, fruits, roots, timber, or even the flora and fauna that were available there. So in the late colonial period itself, in the 1920s and 1930s, what we witnessed were a number of satyagrahas that were organized throughout the Indian subcontinent in order to protest the colonial takeover or the takeover of the forest resources by the forest department. Now the forest department became the lords or landlords of the states, of these regions, and the local communities were the framed as encroachers, or they were framed as people who were destroying forests, were destroying nature and killing wild animals. So Gandhian Satyagraha became a foundation for some of these non-violent resistance movements, because as we had discussed previously, there were a number of violent movements also led by many subaltern groups, particularly Adivasis and peasants. What we witness here, particularly after Champaran, was Satyagraha, or the Gandhian way of linking morality with ethics and politics with economy. So, what he also tried to do was he tried to bring together all the aspects that were concerning local people as well as local communities, and how these communities were getting affected by colonial rules and colonial rules. This way, the Gandhian method of Satyagraha created a foundation on which many other forms of movements were organized. So, for example, the British government did not allow anybody to manufacture salt, and all of us consume salt. That is the reason why, in order to counter that, Mahatma Gandhi led the Dandi Yatra or Dandi March. The same thing was implemented in forest, the same thing was implemented regarding commercial agriculture. And this commercial agriculture was forced upon individuals, were forced upon rural people despite them not willing to do so. So, Chipko movement in a way was an extension of Gandhian political ethics, that we need to link politics with economy, the class issues with that of culture and religious issues. That is the only way one could identify what is happening at the local level and also identify the problematics that are there. In Garhwal Himalayas, there is another kind of the legacy to the Chipko. As I discussed, during the colonial period, Garhwal was not part of British Raj. Rather, whether it was Garhwal Maharaja or other kind of kings, they were the feudatory lords, and these feudatory lords, they were focusing on the kind of laws and regulations that the British was trying to bring. So, while the British was doing something in their own regimes as well as reigns, the local Rajas were also doing the same kind of the policies. So, what we witness is that Tehri Garhwal had a long history of resistance towards forest extraction, particularly in the late 19th century. And why? It was because of the local grievances of loss of access to fodder, fuelwood, and small timber. Without access to fodder and fuelwood as well as small timber, the local people, local villagers were not able to sustain their lives. And as I said earlier, they had usufruct rights. That means they would not have to pay anything for the fodder that they collect from the forest, or the dead branches and dead wood that they would collect from the forest. So, fuel wood and fodder are very significant for animal husbandry as well as for firing the hearth of one's kitchen. Without that, people would go hungry. Without this, the animals would go hungry. So, that is the reason why the local grievances were very significant. The local grievances were to the concerns of the local people. What 1930 also witnessed was the Tehri state or the Tehri Raja brutally suppressing many of these the forest rights as well as forest movements or forest satyagraha. And while they were doing so, they are doing it because the Tehri state as well as Garhwal state, Kumaon state, they were all making a lot of revenue by selling off the local products including timber to the collectors as well as to the merchants from the British Empire. So, while pre-independence period, we witnessed some of these movements. Post independence, the period also, we witnessed movements around women's empowerment, liquor prohibition, and again forests. The Pahadis, famous and infamous for being quite addicted to liquor, which are destroying families. So, the women's empowerment gets linked to prohibition of liquor, and because women are linked to forest, so and its resources, so this kind of movements got centered around women and their rights and what they can and cannot do. 1960s became an era which became a galvanizing point for everybody to come together. Why? Because first they had learned the art of Satyagraha and the craft of Satyagraha. Second, they had witnessed that it's not just a colonial power, but the post-colonial state is also using the same methods of commercial exploitation of resources without acknowledging the rights, without acknowledging the regulations that have been in place, that have been created by the local communities. So, Chipko movement started particularly in 1973-74 when the government gave contract to a commercial enterprise for the falling of ash trees, and these ash trees could then be used for some other commercial purposes. Now, interestingly, while this was going on, it was not the women of that area who got engaged in this. Rather, it was the men who got engaged in looking at what was going on. But the information regarding the tree felling spread like a wildfire. Men were getting harassed by the police, men were getting arrested, a lot of criminal cases were getting filed against them. But this was not happening with women. And as I said before, women were at the forefront in any rural area or in many rural areas, particularly in the hills and tribal areas. Women are the ones who do majority of the household's work, whether it is about collecting firewood, it is about collecting fodder, it is about taking animals for grazing. They are the ones who do all this work, including farm activities. So, when tree felling became a significant part in the commercialization of Garhwal Himalayas, it was the women who were mostly impacted. So, it was a very kind of livelihood issue because of which they had to come out and struggle for their own well-being. So, women's empowerment here is not just about understanding something called Satyagraha, rather it is about linking their own day-to-day life and livelihood with broader ideas of resistance. So, what we also see here is that they adopted something called tree embracing as a non-violent protective technique. In other words, this is what Chipko actually means. You hug a tree, which essentially means that if you before you cut down this tree, you have to cut me down. So, will a contractor or the state or any the laborers, are they willing to kill the women, harass them in order to cut down these trees, or they will not do it? So, it is also a question of what kind of ethics you have. Are your ethics and morally allowing you to kill people for commercial purposes or not? So, this was a non-violent means or a non-violent method to protect your own livelihood. So, women, that is the reason why women became principal organizers, guardians of the forest, and a moral authority. So, Gandhian networks were created, and the ones who were already there, they are used by both men and women throughout the Garhwal valley in order to create the fast procession songs and moral persuasion. So the moral persuasion was not just against the government or towards the government, it was also towards contractors, towards laborers and everybody who is engaged in this, because they were not our enemies. Rather, they are people who are there to do a kind of job, to do a kind of work which is morally incorrect. So the protesters would rather give up their lives than to harm them. But at the same time, they would pursue them through different means that were given and the techniques that were given by Gandhi and the means that he followed. That is where the people like Sundarlal Bahuguna, Chandi Prasad Bhatt, Dhoom Singh Negi became very influential, because they had been the Gandhians, they had worked with Gandhi, so they knew how to use some of these means, these methods, and how to galvanize people. At the same time, because they already had a certain sense of the power as well as influence in that area, so people listened to them, both men and women, and they also listened to people and what they wanted. So that is what led to the multi-valley coordinated resistance by late 1970s. So while livelihood was one issue, second was ecological foundation. What people witnessed was that because of felling of all these trees, because of the so many other commercial activities that were happening in the Himalayas, there was rainfall, and this rainfall was leading to increased floods, landslides and hydrological instability. Again, because now the flood water would take away the topsoil, so the soil's fertility was declining and springs were drying in hill ecosystems. And in it, any one of you who has ever visited the hills knows that most of the people, they use the spring water for their day-to-day lives, not just for drinking but also for every other purpose, including irrigation. So for them, dying or drying of springs in the hills means no water at all, means dying of thirst, no agriculture, no animal husbandry, no farming, as well as no other means of survival there. So what was livelihood issue initially was also an ecological issue. So forests were understood as life support systems, because they were creators of microclimates and they were also taking care of soil and water. So they equated the commercial extraction of forest and its resources as mining of ecological capital. Now this is interesting, because to call ecology as a form of capital and to equate it with mining, that means they are aware of the drawbacks that such kind of extractivism would lead to, and this is happening in the 1970s. We're not even talking about climate change, we're not even talking about 2025. So what we witness here is that by bringing the old concerns of old social movements and the new concerns of the new social movement, Chipko bridged the gap. It did not care whether somebody calls it old social movement or somebody calls it new social movement. Rather, they would argue that we as women, we are the people who are living here and we have to do something for our surroundings. And unless and until we do that, things will not improve at all, which led to Indira Gandhi's announcement of 15 years ban on commercial green felling in Garhwal Himalayas as well as in Kumaon Himalayas. So this was the victory for the movement, and this victory led this movement to spread like wildfire throughout the country. The leaders of Chipko movement, they went to other parts of the country, went outside of the country to mobilize people, to make people aware of the methods that they have used, the way these methods can actually work, and how to make them work. So, in a way, Chipko made the people of Garhwal Himalayas the torch bearers of what was later known as new social movements, green movements, as well as protection of the environmental conflicts. But does that mean that there are no the issues within the movement itself? Of course, as we have discussed during this week, there are always conflicts within a movement. So the concern is what kind of conflicts. Are these conflicts ideological, or are these conflicts only at the surface level? So in the context of Chipko movement, particularly in the context of Garhwal Himalayas, we have the difference of ecological development and eco development, or the difference between Bahuguna's idea of ecological development and Chandi Prasad Bhatt's idea of eco development. Now Bahuguna wanted to have no affairs with how the ecosystem is going to regenerate itself. That means he would let the forest to live and regenerate for itself and not touch it at all. Whereas Bhatt would argue that rather than leaving the forest to regenerate on its own, local people can actually use it at a subsistence level rather at a commercial level, so that local industrialization can be promoted, and this local industrialization can also empower the women of the areas and give them a sustainable livelihood. So for both of them, poverty was an issue, and they also knew that the Himalayas, particularly the present time Uttarakhand, is not doing very well. People are suffering, and how do you mitigate this suffer? You have to mitigate this suffer by using the locally available resources, and they have water, they have trees and forests. If they are not going to use it in a productive way, in a beneficial way, then somebody else will do it. So this continued for a long time. So how has this impacted at the national global level? So as I said, Chipko movement spread to Himachal Pradesh, Karnataka, Rajasthan, and to many other places. They were not called as Chipko, but they are called as some Bachao Andolans. And Chipko also resonated with European forest and anti-acid rain movements, because as I said, it started in the early 1970s, and that was also the time when in Europe, in United States, a lot of non-violence movements were emerging and erupting against acid rain, against destruction of forests, against the against destruction and polluting of rivers, lakes, as well as one very crucial thing that many scholars do not link with Chipko is nuclear tests, because most of the European countries and United States and Soviet Union, they were engaged in this kind of activities without caring what would happen to the world. So they wanted everybody to listen to the voices of these women who were there and who did not only fought against the British but are now fighting against the Indian state and the Indian corporate houses. So if these illiterate women could do it, then of course the more educated, more developed West can also do that. So these are a few discussion questions that we have, and one interesting of them is the question number 3. Can non-violent ecological movements succeed in contemporary political economies, particularly in the context where the governments and the representative of the governments, including the judiciary, are looking at only one type of political economy? that is market economy or a neoliberal political economy. So, can non-violence work, and if yes, how? If not, why not? Think about it and look around you and see how it can be worked out. So, this is the reference from where I have taken, and there are further readings we can discuss later on. Thank you.